Section 4 of Imperialism and World Politics. Part 2 of 4. By Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 9b. The Legacy of Cecil Rhodes. Subsection. The Jameson Raid. From Rhodesia, the greatest achievement of Cecil Rhodes, we must turn our attention to the Boer communities of Transvaal and Orange River. These, as we have seen, had been recognised as self-governing republics, and had been left to pursue their own interests until, with the discovery of gold in the Northern Republic, Transvaal, about the year 1886, a new factor entered into the situation. Footnote: the independence of Transvaal, South African Republic, and Orange Free State was recognised in 1852 and 1854, respectively. Transvaal had been annexed in 1877, but by the Pretoria Convention of August 3, 1881, it had been given self-government under British suzerainty. This action followed the famous Battle of Majuba Hill. The London Convention of February 27, 1884, went a step further, omitting all mention of British suzerainty, but stipulating in Article 4 that the Republic
will conclude no treaty or engagement with any state or nation other than the Orange Free State, until the same has been approved by Her Majesty the Queen.
See State Papers 72, page 900, and 75, page 5, and also on the interpretation of this convention, 91, pages 557 to 646. End of footnote. The thousands of prospectors, labourers and tradesmen who rushed into the Transvaal goldfields in the period after 1886 soon incurred the bitter hostility of the Boer farmers, who believed the land was theirs by right of conquest and settlement, and regarded the newcomers, with some cause, as a disorderly and dangerous element. The Boers, for their part, angered the miners by excluding them from political rights, by levying heavy tariff duties on food and other supplies, by establishing dynamite and railway monopolies, which interfered with the miners' business. Furthermore, mine owners like Rhodes and Rudd needed native labour, and believed that the natives should be forced to work by means of taxation or otherwise. As Rudd said,
"If under the cry of civilization we in Egypt lately mowed down 10 or 20,000 dervishes with maxims,"
he was referring to the Battle of Omdurman,
"surely it cannot be considered a hardship to compel the natives in South Africa to give 3 months in the year to do a little honest work."
But the Boer government interfered with the importation of native labour. John Hayes Hammond, a well-known American engineer associated with Rhodes, estimated that good government would mean a saving of 6 shillings per tonne on gold ore production costs, and that would mean an increase of about $12 million a year in dividends. And to cap the climax, the Boer president, Paul Kruger, showed altogether too friendly a disposition toward the German emperor, who was known to have an indiscreet fondness for the Boers. Under such circumstances, some of the British gold producers and businessmen in Johannesburg conspired to overthrow the Boer government of Transvaal. Hearing of the plot, Cecil Rhodes, with characteristic self-confidence, decided that his was the genius to direct the revolt. He took charge of the scheme, provided funds, arranged for the smuggling of arms as company supplies, and planned to have his Rhodesian military police invade Transvaal in concert with the internal revolution. The capitalists backing the Johannesburg conspiracy, however, insisted that the aim must be to hoist the British flag, whereas the reformers in the so-called National Union, which was the backbone of the movement, desired an independent republican government. This dissension and other circumstances delayed action until Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, an able Scottish physician whom Rhodes had made administrator of Rhodesia, and who had been delegated to lead the Rhodesian police into Transvaal, grew impatient, and resolved to no longer wait. Rhodes attempted to countermand the invasion, but the wires had been cut by Jameson's orders. On December 29, 1895, Dr. Jim, as Jameson was called, set out with about 500 men to invade the Transvaal Republic. When Rhodes heard the news, he exclaimed in consternation,
"Jameson has upset my apple cart."
He had. The invaders were captured on January the 2nd, 1896, after a little fighting. The Johannesburg conspiracy fizzled out as a damp squib, in the words of Rhodes, and the leading conspirators, including John Hayes Hammond, an American, were arrested. Footnote: they were tried and condemned to death, but later released on payment of large fines. End of footnote. The Jameson raid was a fiasco. Had it succeeded, perhaps it might have been sung by later bards as a glorious deed, but its ignominious failure allowed its true nature to appear clearly. It was an illegitimate armed attack on a peaceful neighbour. Rhodes himself had to resign office as a Premier of Cape Colony and submit to a parliamentary inquiry, which condemned the raid and censured him. For his accomplices, Rhodes generously paid lawyers' fees and staggering fines. More alarming was the effect of the raid in releasing pent-up German animosity toward England. As soon as he heard of the raid, the German Foreign Minister, Baron von Marschall, warned the British ambassador that Germany must insist on the maintenance of the status quo in South Africa, and that the London cabinet was perilously mistaken if it felt strong enough to pursue its aggressive policy without consulting the other powers. Indeed, the continental powers might combine against England. Secretly, the German ambassadors in other European capitals were instructed to send out the governments on this project of an anti-English coalition. As more news arrived, Marschall became more excited, and on January 2nd he obtained the Kaiser's consent for a formal protest to England. This was delivered in a very sharp note, warning England that Germany was not minded to accept any alteration in the treaty status of Transvaal. This gruffly worded challenge, by good luck, was recalled the next day when the news of Dr. Jim's failure arrived. Footnote: it had already been delivered at Downing Street, but not yet opened. End of footnote. But the Kaiser himself, eager to show England that Germany could not be safely ignored in such matters, sent his famous telegram, January 3rd, to President Kruger of the Transvaal, congratulating him on his success in defending the independence of the country against foreign attacks. There has been much controversy as to the authorship of this amazing telegram, and the extent of William II's responsibility for its wording, but the real point is that the telegram was not an isolated incident. The German Foreign Office, as we have seen, had previously issued harsh warnings to England. The Foreign Minister had suggested to Kruger an international conference on the status of the South African Republic. German public opinion was greatly excited. The telegram was merely a culminating incident, important because it was public, and because it inflamed British opinion. War seemed not improbable, but Germany found the other European capitals lukewarm or cold toward the proposal of a continental bloc against England, and the Germans themselves were astonished at the violence of British indignation. As gracefully as possible, the Berlin government made its retreat. Incidentally, the Kaiser had hoped to obtain something for Germany, possibly a protectorate over Transvaal, or possession of the valuable port of Lourenço Marques in Portuguese East Africa. But his foreign minister advised him that the former was impossible, and that the latter would mean war against England and France, just as an English attempt to seize the port would mean a combination of France and Germany against England. These suggestions are mentioned only because they illustrate how statesmen must juggle with war and peace in the game of imperialist world politics. The Jameson raid wrecked the hopes which Rhodes had long cherished for the eventual union of the Boer and British communities in South Africa. It was indeed contrary to his lifelong policy of cordial cooperation with the Cape Boers. After 1896, Rhodes retired from political life, more or less under a cloud, and in 1902 he died, leaving the bulk of his huge estate to endow 175 scholarships at Oxford for students from the British colonies, and also from the United States and from Germany. The inclusion of America and Germany is significant as an indication of Rhodes' belief in the mission of the English-speaking peoples, and in the cultural solidarity of the Anglo-Saxons and Germans. This use of his wealth is perhaps in part responsible for the fame he achieved, after death, as a disinterested altruist, his business practices being forgotten. Certainly it helped Americans to look upon him as a far-seeing philanthropist, rather than a far-reaching imperialist, and the name Rhodesia writ large across the map of South Africa, is a reminder to the public of his patriotism, to the cynic of his bargain with Lobengula. Subsection The Boer War. The inevitable effect of the Jameson Raid was to hasten the impending contest between Britain and Boer for supremacy in South Africa. Kruger, the Boer president of Transvaal, became increasingly anti-British in his policy, negotiated an alliance with the other Boer republic, the Orange Free State, and looked to the Anglophobe organisation of the Boers in Cape Colony, namely the Afrikaner Bond, and to Germany and Holland for sympathy, if not support. The British, on the other hand, were impelled toward conflict by three powerful forces. First and foremost, the British mining interests in Transvaal were dissatisfied with the Boer government because, representing the interests of the Boer farmers as opposed to British industrialists, it levied tariff duties on food, compelled British mining companies to buy dynamite and coal at exorbitant prices from monopolies, balked all attempts to establish convenient railway communication with the Cape, permitted the debauching of native labourers by saloons, and, in general, as Mr. Hayes Hammond so admirably explained, reduced the profits of the mine owners by 12 millions a year. Secondly, certain British statesmen felt that British authority must be supreme in South Africa, or none, that sooner or later either the Boers or the British must gain the upper hand. Footnote: the dispute as to whether, by the Convention of 1884, England retained suzerainty over the South African Republic, although the word itself was omitted from the document, was important. See the elaborate controversy in State Papers 91, especially pages 557 through 646. Confer supra, page 173, footnote, at 51 seconds in this section. End of footnote. And finally, British public opinion was intensely concerned with the indignities suffered by British citizens in Transvaal, who were treated as aliens or outlanders by the Boer government. By 1899, there were 180,000 outlanders, including many Germans, Americans, and others, as well as British, as opposed to 80,000 Boers in Transvaal. Though the outlanders owned 2/3 of the land and 90% of the other wealth of the Republic, and were heavily taxed, the Boer minority monopolised the government and insisted on a residence requirement of 14 years for the franchise. Though the economic grievance was fundamental, British statesmen with sure instinct stressed the franchise question in the negotiations which brought on the war. The man chiefly responsible for the break was Sir Alfred Milner, a lawyer, journalist, politician, bureaucrat of mixed German and English blood, who had been appointed High Commissioner for South Africa and Governor of the Cape in 1897 by the arch-imperialist Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. After learning the Boer tongue and thoroughly familiarising himself with the situation, Milner decided to bring matters to a head. On May 4th, 1899, he cabled to Chamberlain,
"The spectacle of thousands of British subjects kept permanently in the position of helots, constantly chafing under undoubted grievances, and calling vainly to Her Majesty's Government for redress, does steadily undermine the influence and reputation of Great Britain."
Footnote: the whole dispatch is worth reading, as it shows how Milner regarded the franchise question as a means of reasserting British determination, and as a cure for the many complaints regarding Transvaal legislation. See State Papers 96, pages 662 through 7. End of footnote. The italicised phrase deserves study. As a matter of fact, the requirement of a few years' residence for the naturalisation of alien immigrants was and is a familiar practice of civilised nations, and Milner himself recognised the right of Transvaal to require a 5 years' qualification, but any term longer than 5 years he considered tantamount to serfdom, helotage. This is a fascinating bit of logic, but still more intriguing is his statement
that the only effective way of protecting our subjects is to help them to cease to be our subjects.
That is, to help them become citizens of Transvaal. Patriotism ordinarily dictates the opposite course, the retention of subjects, and the reader may perhaps wonder why a nation should be so willing to fight in order to protect subjects so unpatriotic as to desire citizenship in another nation. But the paradox is easily explained if one remembers that underneath the superficial franchise question lay the fundamental economic reason why Englishmen desired power in Transvaal, and the imperialistic desire for dominant power in all South Africa. In a celebrated conference with Milner at Bloemfontein, May 31st through June 5th, 1899, President Kruger offered to reduce the franchise qualification from 14 years to 7 on condition that all future disputes be submitted to arbitration.
Such a demand,
Comments one historian,
no self-respecting nation could consider for a moment.
As a matter of fact, even the imperialist Chamberlain was willing to consider it, but Milner was ready to fight for the difference of 2 years, or rather, he was ready to use the difference as a pretext for fighting. For when the Boers later offered to concede the 2 years, he found other grievances. Milner persuaded his chief, and in September was begun the movement of British troops to South Africa from India and the Mediterranean, while an expeditionary force was prepared in England. Kruger, for his part, was no less bellicose. There is little doubt that he considered war inevitable, that he was unduly contemptuous of British military strength, and unwarrantably hopeful of German and other foreign support, and that he prolonged negotiations from June to October, waiting for the southern summer, which would bring grass on the dry veldt for his mounted forces. At length, on October 9th, 1899, he sent a 48-hour ultimatum demanding all of the controversies be submitted to
the friendly course of arbitration,
and that Britain should withdraw her troops from the borders of Transvaal and cancel her other military preparations. The ultimatum was scorned, war was declared, on October 11th, and the next day the Boers attacked a British armoured train. The Orange Free State joined Transvaal. Most Englishmen rallied to their national cause. Only a few, such as David Lloyd George, then a young but promising Welsh firebrand, opposed what he called a war for 45% dividends. The Boer War, thus begun, lasted from 1899 to 1902, and was the greatest foreign war in which Great Britain had yet been engaged, considering the number of British soldiers involved. The Boers never had more than about 40,000 men in the field, but their stubborn courage and the vast extent of the country made British victory difficult. After taking offence at the outset, the Boer armies were defeated and driven back by Lord Roberts and 250,000 men. The Boer capitals were captured, and Kruger fled to Europe, to be rebuffed by the German government, but received as a hero in France and Holland. After Kruger's flight, however, the indomitable remnants of the Boer army continued to wage a bitter guerrilla warfare against the invader. And in order to crush out resistance, Lord Kitchener of Egyptian fame took command of the British forces and conducted systematic drives through one district after another, consolidating his conquests by chains of blockhouses and sweeping the Boer women and children into concentration camps, in which, by the way, there was no little suffering. Only after 40,000 Boers had been captured, 4,000 killed, and other thousands wounded, did the Boer generals consent to sign the peace treaty of Vereeniging, May 31st, 1902, accepting King Edward VII's sovereignty on condition that the Dutch language be permitted in schools and courts, that the conquered republics be given self-government as soon as possible, and that Great Britain pay £3 million as compensation for destroyed farms. In shaping Britain's foreign policy, and therefore in contributing to the international situation which led to the Great War in Europe, the Boer War played no small part. British statesmen, particularly imperialist statesmen, felt as never before the disadvantages of British isolation when they found themselves in 1899 confronted by a disapproving world. Joseph Chamberlain, the Mahdi of British imperialism, after holding conferences with the German Emperor and his foreign minister Count von Bülow, publicly declared on November 30th, 1899, shortly after the outbreak of war in South Africa, that England could not remain isolated. The most natural alliance, he said, would be with the great German Empire, and he even hoped for a new triple alliance of Germany, the United States, and Great Britain, to preserve the peace of the world. For 2 years, secret negotiations for an Anglo-German alliance continued, but they were balked by the clumsiness of German diplomacy, the vehement Anglophobia of the German public, the difficulty of reconciling an Anglo-German bond with the Triple Alliance, and by German naval expansion. During the war, it may be explained, British warships seized 3 German mail steamers, thereby provoking such a storm of German indignation as could with difficulty be appeased by the release of the captured vessels. And this indignation was utilised by Tirpitz and the Kaiser as a convenient means of obtaining the Reichstag's assent to appropriations for the creation of a
fleet of such strength that war with the mightiest naval power would involve risks threatening that power's supremacy.
There and then began that jealous naval rivalry which brought Germany and England into increasing antagonism, and which contributed with other factors to force England into the arms of France and Russia. Subsection: Britain, Boer and Black in South Africa. Milner received the customary reward of successful British Empire builders. He was made a baron in 1901, and a viscount in 1902. He was offered a cabinet post as secretary for the colonies, but preferred during the Reconstruction period to remain at his post in South Africa, acting also as governor of Transvaal and Orange River Colony, which had been annexed during the war. His every effort was bent to
restart the colonies on a higher plane of civilization.
This apparently meant the speedy economic restoration of the country. Boers were repatriated, the gold mines reopened, tariffs and railway rates were brought into uniformity. At the instance of the mine owners, he permitted the importation of more than 50,000 Chinese coolies, bound by indentures for 3 years' work, to provide cheap labour in the mines. Less haste was made in fulfilling the treaty pledge of self-government for the conquered provinces. At last, in 1905, a constitution providing for representative institutions, but not full self-government, was granted to Transvaal, and Milner, with health exhausted, resigned. Later on, it may be added, he became one of the most prominent imperialist statesmen of England, and a member of the War Cabinet during the great struggle with Germany. Milner's policy of importing Chinese coolies in South Africa accorded ill with his talk of
a higher plane of civilization,
for the coolies were little better than slaves during their terms of indenture, working for insignificant wages and subject to flogging for even slight disobedience. This Chinese slavery, as Liberals called it, was one of the reproaches flung at the Conservative Balfour government by the Liberal opposition. When the Conservatives fell from power, the new British cabinet was headed by the anti-imperialist Campbell Bannerman, and included the radical Lloyd George, who had denounced the Boer War. The Premier believed that the Boer War was a disaster, but it could not be undone, nor could its inevitable result, the annexations, be prevented. Great Britain could, however, at least, fulfil the pledge of self-government. This was done for Transvaal in 1906, and the Orange River Colony in 1907, regardless of the danger that the Boer leaders would almost certainly control the 2 provinces under any democratic white franchise. In fact, the first elections gave the Boers a majority in Transvaal and Orange River Colony, and shortly afterwards the Afrikaner Bond, the Boer organisation, won the elections in the Cape Colony. The Boers now had the upper hand in 3 of the 4 colonies, and were soon to have still greater power. General Louis Botha, the Boer Premier of Transvaal, became a friend of Dr. Jameson, whose part in the raid was now a matter of the past, and cooperated with him in promoting a movement for the union of the 4 South African colonies, the Cape, Natal, Transvaal, and Orange River Colony. A convention summoned in 1908 drafted a federal constitution which was approved as the South Africa Act 1909 by the British Parliament, and in 1910 the 4 colonies were federated in the Union of South Africa. From the outset, the Boers dominated the Union government. Botha himself served as Union Premier from 1910 until his death in 1919, and was followed by General Jan Smuts, who had been a comrade-in-arms in the campaigns against the British during the Boer War, and right-hand man of Botha in politics since the war. Botha and Smuts alike believed, as practical statesmen, that in friendly cooperation with the British in South Africa, and under the protecting aegis of the Empire, the Boer people could best prosper, and why not? They were now masters of all British South Africa. Botha and Smuts came increasingly under the spell of British imperialism. Botha conquered German Southwest Africa during the war, and, as a delegate at the peace conference, insisted that it be given to South Africa as a mandate. Smuts served as British commander in the campaign to conquer German East Africa, not for the Boers, but for the Empire. He was an influential member of Lloyd George's war cabinet and a trusted advisor of the London government in imperial affairs. At the Imperial Conference of 1923, Smuts stood forth as a most ardent advocate of imperial tariff preference and imperial economic solidarity. With the British owners of the South African mines, the Boer leaders had at first a quarrel. They opposed and ended the importation of Asiatic labour, but they permitted the importation of Negro labour on the contract system from Portuguese Mozambique, and as time went on they found themselves in ever closer harmony with imperialist business interests. As a South African labour leader put it, they took what may be termed the big finance view of our various internal and domestic problems. The alliance of Botha and Smuts with British imperialism encountered important elements of opposition. Against them, General Hertzog, a talented Boer general, built up a nationalist party whose slogan was "South Africa First," and whose recruits were found chiefly among the Boer farmers of the Backveld and the Boer labourers in the mines. Many of the white workers in the Rand mines were Dutch. The more extreme of Herzog's followers would gladly have hauled down the Union Jack and hoisted a Republican flag. Indeed, during the Great War, several prominent Boer officers attempted an armed revolution, only to be crushed by Botha. Herzog himself, however, refrained from definite treason to the Empire, and his party, surviving the rebellion, became strong enough in 1924 to cooperate with the Labour Party in overthrowing Smuts. With Herzog as head of a Labour Nationalist Coalition cabinet in 1924, the Boer irreconcilables were fairly in the saddle, but they were pledged not to cut loose from the Empire. The very fact that such a coalition and such a pledge were possible suggests that the nationalist movement had become less anti-British and more economic. Boer farmers and labourers were joining with British labourers against imperialist capitalists. The trend of economic imperialism is suicidal. British imperialism in South Africa meant British investments in South Africa, which in turn meant the economic development of South Africa. So long as the economic development was confined to producing more gold and diamonds, more wool, hides, ostrich feathers, copper and other raw materials, and in return importing more British machinery, cloth and other manufactures, colony and mother country might be regarded as realising the imperialist ideal. But inevitably, manufacturing industries spring up to supply local needs. South Africa had 530 factories in 1890, 6,890 in 1920. These local factories in increasing measure are supplying the shoes, the clothes, the machinery used by the colonists, while competing British and foreign manufactures are excluded by almost prohibitive customs duties. From an economic point of view, South Africa is still primarily colonial, in that it is chiefly a source of raw materials and a market for British manufactures, but it is beginning to transition from the colonial to the competitive stage. In this transition, South Africa is confronted by difficult labour and race problems. Not only is there friction between the Boers, who number about 800,000, and other, chiefly British whites, who number about 700,000, there is a growing antagonism between farmer and white labour on one hand, and big business on the other, as in most civilised countries. But graver is the opposition between the white population, 1.5 million in all, and the coloured population of 5.5 million, mostly Negroes. In the early days of Cape Colony, the Boers used the Negroes as agricultural slaves, and it was the London government that took the role of emancipator and champion of the black. Since then, the Boers have continued, on the whole, to insist, like the southern planter, on the racial inferiority of the Negro, and the London officials have leaned toward the humanitarian side, but not sufficiently to prevent Negroes from being divorced from the land. A recent issue of the official yearbook of the Union of South Africa shows that the total land owned by the whites is about 230 million acres, whereas the natives own 2 million, in addition to 1 million owned by missions, and 23.5 millions set aside as native reserves, a total of 27 millions. For 1.5 million whites, 230 million acres For 5.5 million Negroes, 27 million acres. Moreover, by General Porter's Land Act of 1913, natives were forbidden to buy from white lands outside the native reservations. Only 123,000 natives lived on the native-owned farms, more than 2 million lived in the reserves, and the remainder lived either on European-owned soil or worked in the cities and mines. In the mines, 281,000 were employed, at wages averaging about £30 a year, as compared with the £478 received by the average white worker. Negro labourers for the mines were collected on the reservations by recruiting agents who took them on contract for a period of service. At the mines, the black labourers were herded together in compounds or barracks, under special supervision, much as though slavery had never been abolished. Such treatment accorded well enough with the attitude of the Boers, and with the views of imperialists, such as Rhodes, who considered the Negroes lazy folk created by God to render compulsory labour in the mines. But the consequence of such policies was to aggravate the race problem. Instead of learning improved methods of agriculture and becoming prosperous small farmers as in the Gold Coast, the South African Negroes were divorced from the soil, and those employed in industry formed a dangerously discontented industrial proletariat. Moreover, the fact that Negroes could vote in Cape Colony, but not in the other 3 colonies, added a political grievance to economic unrest. Such inequalities were most acutely resented by Cape boys, that is mulattoes, and Negroes who obtained education in mission schools and entered into the skilled trades and professions. One has only to talk with the educated South African Negroes to realise that the ruthless exercise of white supremacy under the aegis of British imperialism has created a Negro reaction of grave character, withal the bulk of the black population is still inert and impotent. By way of contrast, the other British possessions in South Africa, outside the Union, claim passing notice. Rhodesia has already been considered. There is also the vast semi-desert Bechuanaland Protectorate, with its scant population of 150,000 Negro herdsmen, and the small protectorate of Swaziland and Basutoland. The last named has been called the Switzerland of South Africa. It is a beautiful mountain country, a third smaller than the Switzerland of Europe, and inhabited entirely by blacks. Here the land is owned entirely by the natives under a communal system, which they understand better than individual proprietorship, and neither mining nor industry has made inroads on rural simplicity. The native population, tilling its fields and tending its cattle in peace, has quadrupled since British annexation, 1868, and prospered in a most remarkable degree, thanks to the exclusion of concession hunters and white settlers. British imperialism has here been far more benevolent and beneficent than in the Union, partly for historical reasons, but chiefly because there was no great mineral wealth. Taken altogether, the Union, Rhodesia, and the former German Southwest Africa, and the other British colonies in South Africa, constitute a rich and extensive empire almost half as large as the continent of Europe, wonderfully suited by climate for white population, and richly endowed with minerals precious and utilitarian. Yet in all its history it has not attracted as many European immigrants as the United States received in the single year 1913, nor is it rapidly becoming a white man's country. The Negroes still form 4/5 of the population. The dream of Cecil Rhodes and of other British imperialists, that upon the healthful high veldt would some day live a sturdy British people, is not yet realised, or even near fulfilment. But the Transvaal alone had produced $4 billion worth of gold since 1868, over $1 billion worth of diamonds have been exported, and the trade of South Africa, in which England has the largest share, is gradually rising toward the $1 billion level, which it exceeded in the boom year 1920. Here, if anywhere, is to be found the justification of the blood and treasure so freely poured out to make South Africa, in the words of Cecil Rhodes, all red. End of section 4.